My name is Ava, 36 years old, currently living in San Diego. I'm the co-founder of a booming health tech company and once believed I had married the right man, Brett, a calm, intelligent, well-educated husband. Just a few months ago, we celebrated our 5-year anniversary. But all that trust collapsed in less than a minute. I had just returned from an extended business trip, getting ready for Thanksgiving. The grand villa I used to call home felt cold and eerily silent. No flowers, no lights, not even a greeting. Only my father-in-law Richard was lying motionless on the long couch, wearing an oxygen mask like he was waiting to die. Next to him was a short letter, cruel as a knife. My lawyer and I have transferred control of your company to me. Take care of my father. It's time you learned to be quiet. I froze, my hands trembling from anger and humiliation. But before I could gather myself, the old man suddenly opened his eyes and spoke in a strangely strong voice. If he's going to play that way, then it's time I play my game. What would you do if the person you loved most betrayed you right in your own home? Leave a comment below if you've ever been taken advantage of by someone you trusted. Hit like if you believe justice isn't only for the powerful. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel to follow the rest of my story because what happened next, you won't want to miss. I stood frozen in the quiet living room, my breath caught in my throat, strangled by the cold words in that letter. Everything was spinning in my head, not from the shock of betrayal, but from not understanding how someone who had laid next to me every night could strike so viciously. My lawyer and I have transferred control of your company to me. Take care of my father. It's time you learn to be quiet. I read that line over and over again, as if hoping it would somehow turn into a sick joke. But no. Every word was clear, each letter carved into my chest like a blade. Behind me, Richard's voice cut through the silence, low and hoarse, but not weak. If he's going to play that way, then it's time I play my game. I turned around, stunned. He was no longer lying back on the couch. He had sat up, his piercing blue eyes staring directly at me. That face no longer looked tired or lifeless like I had thought. Instead, it was alert, sharp, and filled with quiet disappointment. You don't need the oxygen mask? I asked. He took it off and set it aside. Just a prop for outsiders. I'm not as weak as they think. But I let them believe I was. Long enough. I stepped closer, still guarded. You knew about this? I asked. He nodded slowly. Not just knew. I've been watching. For the past year. That boy is no longer my son. He's a cold, calculating machine, programmed by his mother. I stared at him, a mix of anger, suspicion, and a flicker of fragile hope inside me. Then, why didn't you say anything? Why let them do this to me? To you? He leaned back, eyes half closed as if recalling something distant. Because I needed to see how far they would go. I used to think Brett was just weak. But he knows exactly what he's doing. And Evelyn was the only woman I ever loved and the first to betray me. The room fell into silence for a few seconds. Outside, the sunlight faded through the thick curtains. The space darkened, like my mind at that moment. I've lost everything, you know? I whispered. My company, something I built from nothing, with one idea and a belief in public healthcare, is now in the hands of people who know nothing but profit. I know, he replied, voice deepening. I've lost more than that. I looked at him. What do you want? He tilted his head, those sharp eyes cutting straight through me. I want justice. Not just for me, for both of us. They thought leaving me with you was punishment. But really, that was their first mistake. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to trust. But I knew one thing. I couldn't sit around and wait for justice to arrive. I turned toward the stairs, intending to go upstairs and look through the house, what once was my home, when Richard's voice called out. The study. Second door on the right. There's something you should see. I turned back. His eyes held meaning. The study sat beyond a narrow hallway. Dim light leaked through the glass panels. I pushed the door open. The scent of old wood, aged paper, and a faint touch of mint filled the air. Shelves of neatly arranged books lined the walls. In the center was a dark wooden desk with scattered folders. A large oil painting hung on the wall. I was about to turn away when I realized it wasn't fixed, it was just hanging loosely. I pulled gently. Behind it was a small built-in safe. No password. The wooden door swung open. Inside were stacks of documents, photos, audio recorders, USB drives, and a plan scribbled in red: recover, reclaim, restore honor. I picked up a notebook. Inside was strong, deliberate handwriting. The first line read, counterattack plan, step 1, identify allies. Just then, Richard entered with a cane, slow but steady. I wrote that 8 months ago, he said. What is all this? These documents. Evidence. That they've been draining my accounts, using my supposed medical care to embezzle assets. And proof that Brett used his fake title as CEO to illegally transfer your shares. I flipped through the files. Each page detailed something. Bank transactions, meeting notes, photos of Brett meeting with representatives from a rival firm, everything organized like a long-planned operation. I don't get it, I shook my head. Why trust me? Because I used to be the man in your story, he answered. I loved someone I thought would be with me until the end, only to find out I was just a stepping stone in a bigger scheme. I saw that same look in your eyes. The look of someone who's lost trust but not dignity. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I sank into the chair, hands on my head. My whole body felt drained. I was exhausted, empty, and unsure if I could ever trust anyone again. So, what do you want from me? I asked, voice hoarse. He stepped forward and placed a pre-written contract in front of me. I want you to help me carry out this plan. I'll handle the finances and legal side. You cover media and evidence. I looked up at him. What if we fail? He chuckled softly, not a bitter laugh, but the smile of someone who's ready to go all the way. Then we fail with dignity. But at least I won't die in silence. And you won't live bowed down. I looked at the stack of files on the table, then back at Richard, the man I thought was just a frail old man a few hours ago, and felt a small flame light up inside me. Not enough to burn away all the pain, but enough to begin. It took me almost an hour to skim through the materials Richard called the starter pack. Old, faded documents. Bank statements with crystal clear entries. Audio recordings stored on carefully labeled USB drives. Everything in this back room behind the study was laid out like a covert mission long in the making. On the wall opposite the bookshelf was a large whiteboard. Arrows. Relationship charts. Photos. Names. Timelines. All surrounding one bold red sentence in marker. Counterattack plan. I turned to Richard, who sat calmly by the table, resting one hand on his cane and the other pouring tea like nothing had just happened. How long have you been doing this? I asked, still awestruck. Since I found out Evelyn had a vacation house in Vermont under her name that I'd never heard of, he said flatly. From there, everything began unraveling. And Brett, did you ever think he was just influenced by her? He gave a faint, tired smile, his eyes darkening. I used to hope so. But the look in his eyes when I refused to transfer the accounts to him, it wasn't the look of a disappointed son. It was the look of a man who missed a payday. I stayed silent. My heartbeat slowed because I knew that feeling all too well, that moment when you realize the person who once loved you most was just waiting for the right time to strike. I stepped closer to the board, pointing at a yellow highlighted section. September 12th. Secret meeting with Rivera Group. This really happened? I asked, turning to him. You still have your work email, don't you? I nodded. Check the spam folder. You'll find a thread of emails auto-forwarded from your company inbox to your secondary account. I set up that system when I saw Brett sneak into your laptop in May. I opened my phone, logged in through the internal VPN. Within minutes, the email thread popped up. Inside were draft contracts, meetings between Brett and Rivera, and what seemed like auto-recorded phone transcripts. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. These were undeniable. Brett hadn't just stolen my company, he was planning to sell it in exchange for a position on Rivera's board. I turned to Richard, who sat quietly watching me. You gathered all of this? On your own? What do you think I've been doing all these months while they thought I was bedridden? He raised an eyebrow. I've got old friends, people from the bank, the court, a few at the notary office. We play chess every Saturday. And by the way, I gave them some assignments. I nodded slowly, stunned and quietly impressed. All this time I thought I'd been abandoned, stripped of everything. But as it turned out, the man sitting in front of me had been quietly rebuilding everything from the shattered pieces of betrayal. "Do you still want to fight?" he asked, his voice low but weighted. I took a long breath. "I used to think I was strong," I said. "But now I understand being strong isn't about never falling. It's about choosing to stand back up when everything collapses." He nodded, his eyes glinting in the late afternoon light. "Good. Because what comes next will demand more than courage. It'll take strategy, patience, and a high tolerance for bitterness." "Where do we start?" I asked. "Not we," he replied. "Us." He leaned on his cane and stood, walked over to the safe in the corner, entered the code, and opened a drawer filled with notebooks, small recorders, and a digital camera. "You worked in media, right? Know how to edit photos and cut video?" I nodded. "Before I started my company, I used to design marketing content." "Then here's your first assignment," he said, placing a memory card in my hand. "Compile all the recordings, photos, emails, logs, make a single file. As professional as you can." I took the card, feeling like I was holding more than just data. I was holding the trust of someone who, like me, had once been betrayed. "We're going public?" I asked. "Not yet," he replied. "Let them think they're still in control. When the time is right, the pieces will fall, one by one." I sat at the table and opened my laptop. I started by organizing the folders. I named the first file, "The True Face of Brett Harlan." Under it, I created branches: stock theft, secret deals, personal deception, legal evidence. As I worked, Richard stood behind me for a long while before softly saying, "Don't ever think you're doing this for revenge. You're doing it to reclaim your dignity." I didn't answer. But deep down, I knew this dignity wasn't just mine. It was what was left of him as a father. It took me 2 full days to organize all the documents Richard had gathered over the months. Every time I thought I had a full picture, he handed me another flash drive, another handwritten note, or a printed photo from a hidden camera. We worked in silence but in sync, as if we both understood that time was limited. Every time I looked up, tired, he'd place a cup of hot tea or a homemade cookie in front of me. They were dry and crumbly, but they carried genuine care. On the third afternoon, he suddenly opened a desk drawer and pulled out an old flip phone, the kind you only saw in early 2000s crime dramas. "It's time," he said, eyes narrowing. "I'm introducing you to a few old friends." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean lawyers?" "No," he shook his head. "My network." He dialed a number I didn't recognize until I looked twice. It was a landline. After 3 rings, a raspy woman's voice answered. "This is Flora. Been waiting on your call." "I need the team back," he said simply. "Priority level, Harlan 1. "Got it. The pie shop." "Same place, 11 a.m. tomorrow." I didn't interrupt. When he closed the phone, he turned to me with a soft smile. "You're about to meet the people I trust most in this world besides Martha, my wife," he added, his voice dipping slightly at her name. The next morning, we arrived at a little pie shop on a quiet street corner. I had always thought of it as a retirement spot where seniors read newspapers and drank weak coffee. But stepping inside, the energy was entirely different. 4 people were already seated. One wore a crisp shirt like he'd just walked out of a bank. Another had a worn scarf but eyes that darted like lightning. A woman with white hair neatly tied back smiled at me and motioned to the empty chair. "You must be Ava?" I nodded. "Heard about you," she said, her gaze warm but appraising. "I'm Flora. Sit. The apple pie here's not bad." We sat, ordered coffee, and Richard began the introductions. Flora used to work in intelligence for a now-defunct federal agency. After retiring, she got involved in community work for seniors, and through that, she uncovered something troubling. Many elderly people were being financially manipulated by their own children. Beside her was Harold, a former cybersecurity consultant. He didn't speak much, but his eyes missed nothing. Next was Sylvia, a retired banker who had tracked and printed every suspicious transaction linked to Brett and Evelyn across regional branches. Lastly, Leon, a mechanical engineer who once worked at a defense contractor. He was the one who built hidden recording devices into picture frames, lamps, and even the stair railings in Richard's house. I didn't know whether to be shocked or moved. I looked at Richard and asked quietly, "You really trust them that much?" "Not trust," he said. "Survived with them through financial storms and betrayals. They're what's left of a generation that understood what keeping your word meant." Flora nodded. "And now we want to spend what's left of our time doing something right." I explained what Brett had done to my company, how he forged my signature, sold shares to Rivera, and used his father's condition to blackmail me. No one spoke while I talked. When I finished, Sylvia gently pulled out a folder. "These are all transactions linked to Rivera over the last 3 months, including accounts at the bank I used to work for." 4 anonymous wire transfers matched the timeline Richard recorded. Harold tapped a button on his phone, and a small screen lit up showing a wide-angle view of my old office. This camera was installed back in June, at Richard's request. No one found it, not even IT. Here's a clip of Brett meeting with Rivera's rep. I couldn't believe my ears. Every word Brett said was cold, calculated, without hesitation. He called me a greedy fool, a depreciating asset, and a tool that served its purpose. I gripped my coffee cup tight. My palms were burning, but the rest of me felt ice cold. Flora placed her hand gently over mine. "You're not alone. What we need now is to compile enough evidence, legalize the files, and get ready for the next step." I breathed in, then nodded. "And the next step?" Richard leaned back, eyes gleaming in the sunlight through the glass window. "To let them believe they've won." I looked around at these white-haired warriors. In that moment, this pie shop felt less like a cafe and more like a war room. And I knew I wasn't fighting alone. I returned home with Mr. Richard after our meeting at the bakery. In my hands were the documents and the USB drive containing the video Harold had privately backed up for me. I didn't have the courage to watch it again. Just closing my eyes was enough to hear Brett's voice, cold and calculated like a sharp wind slicing through my chest. The house greeted us with complete silence. I placed the file folder on the dining table and slowly stepped into the study, the very room where I had spent countless nights drafting ideas for the company's first project. My earliest sketches were still laminated and pinned to the corner of the wall, not for show, but as a reminder to myself, this is where it all began. Now I had to ask myself, but when did everything truly begin? I opened my computer, sifting through old emails and messages exchanged with Brett. Each sweet note, each attachment with feedback on the project, each word of encouragement during difficult times, they were all too perfect, too well-timed, too calculated. Then I paused at one particular email I had sent 5 years ago, just a week after our company received its first angel investment. I wrote, "Lucas wants to grab coffee to talk about switching to an LLC structure. What do you think?" Brett replied almost immediately, "Lucas is your close friend. I trust him. If you need someone to co-sign or be a legal witness, use me. We should do everything professionally, without emotional barriers." I sat there, staring blankly at the screen. Back then, I thought Brett was a modern man, supportive, not jealous or controlling. Now I realized he wasn't letting go because he trusted me. He let go because he had already planted someone by my side. I called Flora. Her voice remained steady and firm. "What do you need, Ava?" "I need a full record of all transactions between Evelyn and Lucas over the past 3 years. Bank, real estate, even tuition payments for his daughter." "Understood. I'll send Sylvia to handle that." "You still think he was a friend?" "No," I replied slowly. "I'm just checking how foolish I really was." I shut the laptop and opened my old filing cabinet. I kept a paper copy of every signed contract. Partly because I always feared digital systems could be compromised, partly because old habits die hard. Inside the contract folder between my company and the strategic investor from the second year, there was a clipped addendum, a document that allowed a temporary representative to inherit voting rights if the CEO was absent for over 30 days. My signature was clear. Next to it, Brett's name. I remembered the day Lucas showed up at my house with 2 cups of coffee and said, "You should sign this, just in case. The market's volatile right now. We need someone authorized to make decisions if you're away." I remembered laughing, joking, "I trust you guys." I had signed while my kitten jumped on the table, knocking coffee onto the documents. Rushing to clean up the mess. I had signed my own trap. That evening, Mr. Richard found me sitting motionless at the desk, lights off, computer closed. "What did you find?" he asked gently, not needing many words to understand. "I found the day I started losing myself." He didn't press further. Just placed a glass of fresh orange juice next to me and sat down silently. After a few minutes, he spoke softly. "You once asked why I didn't pull my money from Evelyn's hands earlier." I nodded. "Because I, too, believed that love could overcome scheming. I didn't want to believe the person beside me in bed was sharpening the knife meant for my back." I turned to look at him for the first time. I saw in his eyes something that wasn't anger or calculation but regret. A raw, painful kind of truth. "And you?" he asked. "Are you ready?" "I've lost my company, my friends, even what I called a marriage. I have nothing left to protect." He nodded, then opened his briefcase and pulled out an old photo, my wedding photo with Brett. I was stunned. "I got this from his bedroom. There's a recorder hidden behind the frame." I had a feeling. I flipped it over. A tiny slit. Inside was a small SD card. Harold had backed it up already. When I inserted it into the computer, the audio began playing. Evelyn's voice was sharp and cold as steel. "She won't suspect a thing. Ava trusts Lucas like she trusts herself. When the time comes, you just need to get her to sign. I'll take care of the rest." I clenched my fists so tight, my nails pressed into my palms. I didn't cry, not because of Evelyn, not because of Brett, but because of Lucas. The friend I once thought would be godfather to my child. "Can you help me meet him again, without raising suspicion?" I asked. "I have an idea," Mr. Richard said, a slow smile forming. "A game of chess, where the player doesn't know their piece has already been switched." I never imagined myself adjusting lighting in the living room, angling the camera just right to capture the face of an old man pretending to gasp for breath, his forehead damp with water I had dabbed by hand. But that's what I did. Not for drama, but for truth. Mr. Richard lay on the temporary hospital bed, wearing a medical gown Flora had sent from a closed clinic, an IV loosely attached to his arm, disconnected from any real fluid. I carefully placed the oxygen tank beside him, opening the valve just enough to let out a gentle hiss, adding to the illusion. "Don't overdo it," he whispered, eyes barely open. "I know," I said calmly. "Let the lighting do the rest." Harold had set up a private livestream network. Only devices with authentication codes could access it. I made sure Evelyn and Brett were on that list. I created an anonymous account named Housebound3, and sent it from a burner number I had prepared long ago. The first message was short. "He doesn't have much time." Attached was a 2-minute video of me holding Mr. Richard's hand at his bedside, my hands trembling. The lighting was dim, classical music playing softly through a Bluetooth speaker, his late wife's favorite. "Brett," he whispered in the clip, his voice so frail that even I had to choke back tears while filming. "Can you come home? Just want to see you once more." I added a single line. "I don't. I know what else to do. I'm so tired. I don't think I can take another day." I set the phone down. Mr. Richard sat up straight, exhaling hard as if shedding the mask he'd just worn. I handed him a towel, then poured him a glass of water. "You were brilliant," I said, managing a bitter smile. "Not as brilliant as you," he replied. "You played the broken woman without shedding a tear. That's the highest art." I didn't laugh. None of this felt like a game anymore. That night, I edited several clips, splicing in moments where Richard grimaced, overlaying a subtle heartbeat sound from a medical library. I assembled a 5-minute video just long enough to trigger panic in those living on the edge of guilt. Brett didn't reply right away. But an hour later, I got a message from Evelyn. "Don't escalate this. Send medical records if you want help." I forwarded it to Mr. Richard. He said nothing, only pulled out a real medical file from his oncologist, confirming stage 4 pancreatic cancer. "I plan to keep it to myself," he said. "But now, we'll use their own dagger against them." I photographed every page, adding a yellow tint for an aged effect, then sent them with a note. "Doctor says he only has a few weeks. I can't think anymore. If you want to come, do. If not, just let him go in peace. I included an audio clip of Richard calling Brett in his sleep, stitched together by Harold from previous videos. His voice was raspy and broken, repeating one phrase, "Brett, come home. Your father is begging you." I sent it at 2 a.m. By 7 a.m., I received a message from Brett's number. Just 4 words. "We'll be there Monday." I read those words in silence. My hands were ice cold. Not from fear, but from knowing I was now standing at the peak of the game. "Mr. Richard gave a small nod as I finished reading aloud. "Two predators," he said, "will never return unless they believe the prey is about to die." I turned toward him and looked him straight in the eye. "Then let's show them. They've come back at exactly the right time." I stood in the middle of the living room that Saturday afternoon, adjusting every detail on the dining table by hand. The ivory white tablecloth had been ironed to perfection, the crystal glasses aligned, and the scented candles were waiting to be lit. To an outsider, this looked like a small, heartfelt family gathering an act of goodwill from the daughter-in-law once cast aside. But I knew every chair around that table wasn't set to show gratitude. They were waiting for a scene, perfectly timed, perfectly cast. "You look more like you're hosting a wedding than a farewell," Mr. Richard said behind me, his tone floating. I turned and gave a faint smile. I never got a second wedding, so I figured I'd make this one count. He chuckled, shook his head slightly, then placed his hand gently on my shoulder. "They won't know what happened until it's all over." I nodded. "And I won't flinch. Not even for a second." At 4 in the afternoon, the first special guest arrived. A tall man with silver hair and a slow stride, wearing a white lab coat. He reached out to shake my hand, his eyes bright behind thin-framed glasses. "I'm David Whitmore, temporary family physician per Mr. Richard's request," he said quietly. In reality, he was a retired judge who had presided over numerous civil cases involving asset theft in marriage. A man who knew the law better than most attorneys in the courtroom. Shortly after, a woman in a nurse's uniform entered, carrying a fake medical kit. She was Grace, Mr. Richard's former attorney, who had withdrawn from practice after her husband's death but never stopped fighting for real justice. The last to arrive was a young man with a warm smile and a chef's jacket, cracking light jokes like a hired kitchen hand. But he was actually Thomas Lyle, an investigative journalist with the Denver Independent, known for exposing a statewide medical insurance fraud scheme. All three had been equipped by Harold with hidden cameras in their shirt buttons, eyeglasses, and a wristwatch that recorded audio in real time, streaming securely to a remote storage system Flora controlled. I ran one final check. Lighting, perfect. Audio, clear. All exits unlocked just in case. At 12 minutes past 6, Brett's car pulled up in front. Through the curtain slit, I saw him step out, wearing a buttoned-up white dress shirt, empty-handed, his expression so stiffly respectful I almost laughed. Evelyn followed behind, in a long navy coat and heels clicking sharply on the wood floor. She didn't glance around like someone returning after a long absence. She walked in like she still lived there. "Hey," Brett said, eyes scanning me. "Thanks for the invite." I tilted my head slightly. "Thanks for being on time. He's been waiting." Evelyn stepped forward, eyes surveying the room. "I heard he's very weak." "Still clear-headed enough to wait for this meeting," I replied. Then led them to the living room where Mr. Richard was already seated under a thin blanket, his complexion slightly pale thanks to the makeup I'd learned from a medical simulation video. "Dad," Brett said as he approached. "I'm here." Mr. Richard slowly lifted his head, voice raspy. "Here for the inheritance or for me?" I kept my eyes on Evelyn. She didn't blink. She sat with her back straight, hands clasped, her demeanor more suited to a contract signing than a family reunion. "I came back to make things right," Brett said, sitting at the bedside and placing a hand on the blanket. "No matter what, you're still my father." Mr. Richard smirked. "You didn't call once in 6 months. But a few video clips and one feeble message suddenly bring you running. You think I don't know why?" Evelyn cut in. "We didn't come to argue, Richard. We came because Ava said you were dying." I took the seat across from them, placing my teacup gently onto its saucer. "I didn't lie. He is in late-stage illness. But his mind is still sharp enough to remember who betrayed whom. The room went quiet. Grace entered with a tray of water and pastries. She set it down gracefully and bowed like a well-trained server. No one noticed the tiny red light pulsing from the button on her blouse. "Let's just get to the point," Brett said, adjusting in his seat. "I won't deny there were mistakes. But if there's a chance to make amends, what do you want?" Mr. Richard locked eyes with his son and spoke slowly, clearly. "I want the truth. From your own mouth." Brett hesitated. "What truth?" "That Ava's entire marriage was part of your mother's plan. That you knew from the beginning you were playing a game." I saw Brett's hand clench slightly, then glanced at Evelyn. She remained composed, lips curling slightly like someone with a prepared rebuttal. "We supported Ava in many ways," she said. "Money, time, even reputation. If she lost the company, it was due to incompetence." I smiled faintly and pulled a USB drive from my pocket. "This," I said, placing it gently on the table, "contains the full email chain from Evelyn to Lucas, my closest friend, discussing how to trick me into signing the proxy documents. It also includes an audio recording of Brett's meeting with Rivera's representative, all backed up 3 times. One for the attorney, one for the journalist in this room, and one already sent to the state tax office." Brett jumped to his feet. "You've lost your mind, Ava." "I'm just giving back exactly what you and your mother orchestrated," I answered, my voice so calm I barely recognized myself. Evelyn stayed seated, but her hand had curled into a fist. Her eyes were no longer serene. Mr. Richard tapped the armrest of his chair lightly. "Thank you all for attending this family dinner," he said, his voice suddenly clearer. "Now, it's time to announce the inheritance." I checked the clock. 7 o'clock sharp. The exact moment part 2 of the plan was to begin. And Brett, along with his mother, still hadn't realized they'd just stepped into a stage where every word, every move since crossing that threshold, had been recorded in full. I remember it vividly, Brett standing tall, both hands on the armrest, as if about to deliver a heartfelt speech on family values. In front of him sat Mr. Richard, still under the blanket, eyes closed like he was fading. Brett inhaled deeply, then spoke with a voice low and steady, trying to regain control of the room. "I know things have gone too far, but I'm still human. I've made mistakes. I've been afraid. Dad, I came back because blood still matters more than anything. If there's any chance for forgiveness, it's tonight." I saw a flicker of alarm in Evelyn's eyes. She realized Brett was going off script and started to suspect something. But she stayed silent, just rested her hand on her knee and pinched her dress hem. Brett went on, voice trembling now, trying to stir emotion. "You always taught me that honor isn't in wealth, but in how a person makes things right. I'm not asking for money or property. I'm just asking for a chance to start over." "And how exactly do you plan to start over?" The voice didn't come from the man lying in the chair. It came from behind the room. Every head turned toward the sound. Mr. Richard, the man they thought had been bedridden for hours, was now walking out from the back room, upright, no cane, no blanket, no trace of fatigue on his face. He wore a black dress shirt, cuffs neatly buttoned. His eyes no longer weary, but glowing with a clarity only survivors of betrayal carry. "Dad." Brett stepped back. "Dad. What are you doing?" "Wake up," Richard said, his voice sharp like wood tapping against tile. "I'm not as weak as you thought. And I'm definitely not blind, no matter how much you hoped I was." Evelyn shot up. "Richard, what is this?" "It's a real party, Evelyn," he said, locking eyes with her. "Candles, cake, and a full spotlight." I gently pressed a button on the phone hidden in my pocket. Instantly, the room lit up as cameras around us switched on. The TV on the wall in the living room blinked to life, displaying a split-screen feed. One frame showing Brett signing an unauthorized power of attorney, another playing a voice recording from the cafe meeting with the Rivera representative, a third capturing Evelyn speaking to Lucas on the phone about removing Ava from the company, and the last was of me, face dry, voice steady, reading aloud every promise they'd once written in emails to me. The room froze. Brett gripped the armrest. "This can't be." "Can't be what?" Richard replied calmly. Can't be the truth. You talk about honor, but you sold it for a job title. You talk about blood, but you forged your father's signature. Evelyn turned toward me, her voice sharp. You orchestrated all of this. I just gathered the pieces you two left behind while trying to wipe me out, I replied slowly. And turned it into a complete report. Grace stepped out of the kitchen holding a thick folder. She was no longer just a housekeeper. Her blouse was undone to reveal a name tag pinned at the collar. Grace Langford, legal representative. These are Mr. Richard's account statements, a list of unlawful transfers, the contract signed with Ava's forged signature, and the audio recordings all verified through voice authentication. Everything has been notarized this morning by Judge David Whitmore. David, the man everyone knew as our family doctor, nodded slightly and handed over a document, stamped in red. I looked at Brett. His face no longer wore the expression of a man seeking forgiveness but of one whose mask had been ripped away. His eyelids twitched, his jaw clenched, and sweat gathered at his temples. I'll sue, Brett said, his voice breaking. This is entrapment. A breach of privacy. You're welcome to try, I said, stepping closer. And while you're busy prepping your lawsuit, I'll be forwarding this audio to the tax office, the Financial Crimes Division, and the Rivera Board. I pulled another USB from my pocket and placed it on the table. So they'll know exactly who they're about to promote as Director of Market Development. Evelyn sank into her chair. One of her high heels slipped off unnoticed. The eyes that once looked at me like I was a burden were now hollow, like she'd finally realized the game was over. Richard stepped up to his son, stopping just one step away. You didn't just betray your wife, he said, voice low but heavy. You betrayed your own father, the man who paid for your education, who shouldered your mother's debts, who believed you could be better. Brett looked down and said nothing. I'm still alive, Brett. And I've lived long enough to flip this board, he said, turning toward me. Thank you, for not bowing your head like I once did. I said nothing. I didn't need to. In that moment, the truth stood fully exposed, undeniable. No more words were necessary. I stood still in that room where every mask had fallen away, where only deceitful eyes and the silence of judgment remained. But this unveiling was just the beginning. Grace took a step forward and pulled out another folder, this one sealed and crisp. These are the final will and asset transfer documents signed by Mr. Richard Harlan, witnessed legally by 2 individuals and a retired judge, she announced, each word falling like weight onto the old wooden table. And it's time to read them now. Never had I imagined being present for a legal declaration that would reshape everything, especially not in the very living room where I once wrapped birthday gifts for my husband and arranged flowers for our first Thanksgiving. But it was happening right in front of me, under the soft yellow light from a time-worn chandelier. Grace opened the folder. According to the formally documented wishes of Mr. Richard Harlan, full ownership of the property at 218 East Glenview Drive is transferred to Ava Mitchell. In addition, all shares held under his name across 3 trust-held companies, including 17% equity in Horizon Tech, the medical technology firm founded by Ava, are now hers. I was speechless. I never knew Richard had been quietly buying shares of my company, small portions, through what I assumed were anonymous investors. Bank accounts held at Brentley & Co. Private Bank have been converted into independent accounts under Ava Mitchell's name as the sole beneficiary. As of this morning, the total value of those assets is $5.7 million. I could hear Brett's breath hitch from across the room. Grace continued without pause. Furthermore, according to the attached supplementary clause, Mr. Harlan grants Ava full oversight and distribution rights over the Harlan Foundation, including $2.3 million allocated for statewide programs to combat elder abuse. Evelyn suddenly stood up, nearly screeching. No, this is fake. Richard would never give everything to an outsider. You mean your daughter-in-law, I said calmly, looking her in the eyes. The one you left alone to care for your sick father-in-law on Thanksgiving. The one you told to learn her place. You're a snake. Evelyn hissed through clenched teeth. No. I'm just a mirror. And you're finally seeing yourself in it. Grace didn't flinch. According to the terms of the will, Brett Harlan is excluded from all inheritance due to fraud, legal manipulation, and indications of criminal misconduct involving misappropriation of another person's assets. Brett clenched his fists but stayed silent. He knew it was over. Everything had been verified: signatures, voice prints, video footage, witnesses. Grace kept going. As for Mrs. Evelyn Harlan, documents confirming intentional forgery of signatures, fabrication of false power of attorney documents, and the manipulation of Ava Mitchell's personal legal counsel will be forwarded to the Colorado State Financial Investigation Bureau. We will fully cooperate with the investigation. Evelyn staggered back into her chair. I glanced at Richard. He said nothing, just looked at me and gave a slow nod. He had done everything so I wouldn't have to keep paying for crimes I never committed. Grace wasn't finished. Finally, regarding Mr. Lucas Raymond, a representative of Whitcomb and Hale legal firm and former college friend of Ava Mitchell who provided false documentation to help Brett Harlan validate the illegal power of attorney. My hands gripped the table tighter at his name. Lucas, the friend who once laughed with me at graduation, who patted my shoulder when I launched my first startup. Mr. Lucas Raymond has been suspended from practicing law for 90 days and will face a professional ethics board review for reinstatement. His office has also agreed to pay legal damages to Ava Mitchell in the preliminary amount of $140,000. I bowed my head slightly. I didn't need an apology from Lucas. I only needed the law to confirm that my trust wasn't misplaced, it was betrayed. As Grace closed the folder, the snap of the clip sounded like the final bell sealing away every excuse. Brett hung his head. Evelyn had nothing left to say. And me, the woman who once walked into this house with nothing after a backstabbing business trip, now stood tall. Not for what I had gained, but for what I had reclaimed with patience, intelligence, and dignity no one could buy. Richard turned to me, his voice softer than ever. Now, the control is where it belongs. I didn't look at him. I just held his hand tightly. Because I knew, beyond the numbers and properties, the greatest thing he had given me was the trust I thought I'd lost forever. After the room finally fell into silence, Richard asked me to sit beside him on that same worn leather chair where he used to read every afternoon. He poured himself a cup of tea, his hands no longer trembling, his eyes gazing out the window where the soft evening sun bathed the backyard in golden light. I stayed quiet. There was something in his expression that told me what he was about to say mattered more than all the legal declarations that had just been made. You know, Ava, he began, his voice slow and steady, when elderly people are abandoned by their own children, they don't die from illness. They die from being treated like they no longer matter. Like objects. Only remembered when someone needs a favor. Or an inheritance. I turned to look at him. He wasn't crying, but I could hear the bitterness in every pause between his words. I used to think that leaving behind a sizable estate meant I'd done my part as a father. But I was wrong. I let Evelyn manipulate my son's emotions. Turn him into a reflection of her, calculating, cold, and selfish. I saw it happening early on. But I didn't have the courage to fix it while I still could. I spoke softly. You did fix it. With everything you've done these past few weeks. He gently shook his head, looking at me the way a father looks at a child who means well but hasn't fully understood. No. What I did to Brett, those were consequences. But what I'm leaving to you, that's redemption. I didn't quite understand until he reached into the side drawer of the Times' table and pulled out a thick ivory-colored folder. On the front, in bold black letters, it read, Harlan Foundation. Implementation Plan. This is the charity I drafted 5 years ago, he said. It came to life after I consulted on a case. An elderly man drained of his care funds by his own daughter, then dumped into a nursing home no one had ever vetted. When that case ended, I promised myself I'd create something, an organization to protect those with no one left. I gently opened the folder. The entire plan was handwritten, filled with diagrams, lists of potential partners, reserve account details, even a sample speech to be read at the launch ceremony. But then I backed out, he continued. Evelyn told me it was a sentimental waste, just something that would bleed me dry. And I shelved the whole thing, until I watched you taking care of me without knowing I was testing your heart. I looked up, my throat tightening. You never asked if I'd leave anything to you. You never hinted. You didn't scheme or demand. You just cooked meals, set my pills, fluffed the pillows, and listened while I told stories about Martha. He looked at me for a long moment, then placed his frail hand on mine. You made me feel like a person again. And that's why I want you to lead the Harlan Foundation. I blinked. You want me to? Run the foundation. Revive the plan. Sign contracts with elder care centers. Build a rapid response legal team for abused seniors. You have the mind, you have the heart, and you have the experience both inside and outside the family. I squeezed his hand. But I'm not a social welfare expert. You can hire one. But no expert will have the kind of heart it takes to rise from the ruins after being trampled by your own. I looked down at the folder in my lap. That strange yet familiar feeling returning as if I were holding my very first startup proposal again, full of hope but laced with fear. Only this time it wasn't for profit or prestige. What Richard was offering was his final wish, his way of leaving the world with dignity. How long do you have? I asked softly. He was quiet for a moment, then said, The doctor says 2 months maybe, if I pursue aggressive treatment. But I don't want a hospital bed. I want to see the launch of this foundation. I want to hear you read that speech even if I cry through it. I nodded. Then we'll start tomorrow, I said, voice trembling but firm. No, he said. We start tonight. I've already booked a meeting with a nonprofit media group in Denver. You just need to grab your coat, bring this folder, and come with me. I let out a soft laugh, one that didn't quite match the heaviness of the moment. You never fail to surprise me. Because I don't have time to wait anymore, he replied, standing with a quiet grace. And when he slipped into his thick cardigan, adjusted his tie, and said, Let's go, I knew I was no longer the woman once left behind in an empty house. I had become the one chosen to carry the last light of a man's life, and make it warm enough so no one else would ever have to die in silence again. I stood still in the courtyard of the old estate, the early winter wind brushing against the bare maple trees, carrying with it the scent of dry grass, damp soil, and faint traces of black tea from the kettle Richard used every morning. The sky overhead was cloudless, but my heart felt heavy as if it might rain any second. His funeral was simple, just as he'd written in the handwritten letter sent to his lawyer, no extravagant floral arrangements, no long speeches. Just a few close friends, a handful of team members from the Harlan Foundation, people he'd quietly placed his hopes in. Later that afternoon, after everyone had gone, I stayed behind near the old maple tree by the edge of the yard where Richard used to read every evening. In my hands was one final handwritten letter that had arrived that very morning. His handwriting was still firm, still even not shaky, not weak, just the unwavering script of a man who had lived his truth. My daughter. They thought they had locked you inside a prison, but you turned it into a fortress. You don't need to share my blood to be family. You only need a heart big enough not to turn anyone away, not even an old, stubborn man like me. When I saw you measure every pill, adjust every pillow, sit through every story about Martha, I knew you wouldn't just save yourself. You would save others, those the world had already forgotten. Don't be afraid of loneliness. Because from now on, my legacy will be your voice. And this house, it finally has a rightful owner. Your old man, Richard. I clutched the letter in my hands, tears falling in silence. Not tears of parting, but of something deeper, of recognition, of trust, and of a bond stronger than blood. In the days that followed, I returned to the company headquarters, the one Brett had once sold off in a single contract. Now, under the new name Harlan Health Systems, I wasn't just the CEO. I was the person reshaping its entire mission, bringing elder care technology to every small town, every forgotten community, every home that once seemed invisible. At the first meeting with the new board of directors, I walked into the room wearing a simple black suit, adorned only with a small pin shaped like a key, the symbol of the Harlan Foundation. No one started by discussing profits. No one asked about quarterly figures. The very first question was, which community can we start helping first? I remember smiling. Not a victorious smile, but one of quiet assurance, knowing I was finally on the right path. We'll start where Mr. Richard once told me to, I said. A nursing home tucked away in a Brooklyn alley. The place where he met an elderly woman abandoned by her son, with no one even noticing. A few weeks later, I officially launched the Harlan Foundation at a conference on elder abuse attended by social workers, attorneys, doctors, and people who had lived through the pain firsthand. Each person shared a story, a wound, a time they were ignored. And after every single testimony, I understood even more why Richard had called this the most meaningful fight of his life. The memoir The Father Who Never Gave Up was released that spring. It wasn't a tearful confession or a list of grievances. It was a journey to lives that seemed unconnected, an old man who had lost faith in his own family, and a woman betrayed by her husband, who together turned their pain into purpose. The book barely mentioned Brett or Evelyn. They didn't deserve to be the center of the story. The focus was on those forgotten by the world, the ones labeled a burden, in the way, or useless. We released the book alongside a fundraising campaign. In just 3 months, we raised enough money to open 3 free legal centers for elderly abuse survivors in Ohio, Michigan, and New York. I knew if Richard were still alive, he wouldn't offer praise. He would just nod quietly and say, "There are still more places. I still live in Richard's house now, mine. I haven't changed much, just added a few more photo frames. One corner of the library is now where I write. The other is the volunteer team's workspace every weekend. Every evening I brew tea, play old jazz records, and reread some of Richard's notes like he's still somewhere close, just a glance away, reading the paper by the window." Someone once asked me, "Ava, why don't you sell that house and move into the city? It'd be more convenient." I just smiled. Because they didn't understand that the place that once felt like a prison is now where I feel most free. I didn't take revenge by destroying anyone. I responded by standing tall, leading forward, and honoring a final promise from a father who didn't give up, not on himself, but on the generation that came after him. And when someone tells me, "You're so strong," I just smile and whisper in my heart, "No. He's the one who taught me how to rise when the whole world thought I'd already fallen." What would you do if the person everyone discarded turned out to be the one who pulled you out of the darkest place in your life? Does blood matter more than trust and choice? My story with Richard may have started with lies and schemes, but it ended in understanding and true kinship. Have you ever experienced something like that? Someone who seemed small, forgotten, yet turned out to be the only one who stood by you. I would truly love to hear your thoughts after listening to this story. Please share your reflections in the comments. You never know, your story might be the very thing someone else needs to hear to find their way again. And if you enjoy heartfelt journeys about family, betrayal, trust, and healing, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the stories to come, where every voice holds a slice of real life. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. We'll meet again through stories where anyone might find a piece of themselves.